Angela Carter walked into the small neighborhood grocery store one sunny afternoon. She wasn't there to cause trouble. Angela was 8 months pregnant and visibly exhausted, carrying a quiet determination in her every step. Life hadn't been kind to her lately. Her job at the local diner had cut her hours, and she was struggling to make ends meet. She just wanted to get some food to last her a few days. Angela picked up a loaf of bread, some canned soup, and a carton of milk. She counted the coins in her pocket while standing in the corner of the store. It wasn't enough. Her stomach twisted as she looked at the groceries in her hands. She thought about her unborn baby, the life she was fighting to bring into the world. Taking a deep breath, Angela slipped the loaf of bread into her bag. She promised herself she would come back and pay for it as soon as she could. She walked toward the exit, hoping no one would notice her. But the store clerk, a sharp-eyed middle-aged man, did notice. "Hey, stop right there," he shouted, his voice echoing through the aisles. Angela froze. Her heart pounded in her chest as the clerk picked up the phone and dialed the police. Within minutes, Officer Mark Reynolds arrived. He was a young cop, new to the force, but already known for his strict adherence to rules. When he walked into the store and saw Angela, he didn't see a tired, struggling mother. He saw a suspect. The clerk pointed toward Angela. "She's stealing. She put a loaf of bread in her bag." Angela tried to explain, her voice shaking. "I was going to come back and pay. I just didn't have enough money right now." But Officer Reynolds wasn't interested in her explanation. "Step outside, Mom," he ordered, his tone firm. Angela hesitated, but she followed him out to the parking lot, her hands trembling. Outside, the situation escalated quickly. A small crowd gathered, watching from a distance. Angela tried to speak, her voice cracking under the weight of her fear and embarrassment. "Please, I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I needed food." Officer Reynolds misread Angela's movements as she reached toward her bag, perhaps trying to show him the bread. He thought she was reaching for something else. His training kicked in, but not his judgment. In a split second, he drew his weapon and fired. The sound of the gunshot echoed in the quiet neighborhood. Angela fell to the ground, clutching her stomach, her eyes wide with pain and disbelief. The loaf of bread fell from her bag, landing on the pavement next to her. The crowd gasped, some pulling out their phones to record what had just happened. Angela's voice was faint as she whispered her final words. "Tell my son. I'm sorry." Officer Reynolds froze, his gun still in his hand, as the reality of what he'd done began to sink in. The bystanders shouted in anger and disbelief, their voices blending into a chaotic symphony of grief and rage. Within moments, paramedics arrived, but it was too late. Angela Carter was gone. The once quiet street had turned into a scene of heartbreak and confusion. Little did Officer Reynolds know, the woman he had just fatally shot wasn't just another struggling mother. She was the mother of Michael Carter, a millionaire entrepreneur who would soon find out about the tragedy that would change his life forever. As the crowd began to disperse, the video of the incident started spreading online, igniting a firestorm that would shake the entire community to its core. This was just the beginning of a story that would demand justice, redemption, and change. The video of Angela Carter's tragic death spread across social media like wildfire. It was impossible to ignore. The shocking footage of a pregnant woman lying lifeless in a parking lot sent waves of anger and sadness through the community. People from all over the neighborhood shared the video, adding their own thoughts. This could have been avoided. She didn't deserve this. Why wasn't there a better way? Within hours, protests began to form outside the grocery store where the incident took place. People held signs that read, "Justice for Angela," and "Stop the violence." The community's frustration wasn't just about this one tragedy. It was about years of feeling unseen, unheard, and unsafe. Meanwhile, Officer Mark Reynolds was placed on administrative leave. He sat at home, watching the news coverage in silence. His hands trembled as he replayed the events in his head. He didn't mean for it to happen like this, But no amount of regret could undo what had been done. His decision to act without understanding the situation had changed everything. The story quickly gained national attention. News channels picked it up, showing clips of the video and interviewing witnesses. One of the witnesses, a young woman named Lisa, spoke with tears in her eyes. She was just trying to explain herself. "I saw her bag. There was only a loaf of bread. Why did it have to end like this?" Far away in a different city, Michael Carter sat in his office, focused on a meeting with his team. Michael was a self-made millionaire, known for his successful tech startup and his inspiring story of overcoming hardship. He hadn't spoken to his mother, Angela, in years. Their relationship had grown distant as Michael focused on building his career. He always told himself he'd visit her someday when things slowed down. That someday came too late. One of Michael's closest friends, Jordan, burst into his office, holding a phone. "Michael," he said, his voice shaking. "You need to see this." Michael frowned, taking the phone. As the video played, his heart sank. He recognized the woman on the screen instantly. No, that's my mom," he whispered, his voice cracking. The room spun around him as he watched the final moments of her life unfold. Jordan placed a hand on Michael's shoulder. "I'm so sorry, man. I didn't know how else to tell you." Michael sat in silence for a moment, the weight of guilt crushing him. He hadn't been there for her when she needed him most. Now she was gone, and there was nothing he could do to change that. But Michael was not one to sit idly by. Through his tears, a fire ignited in him, a determination to seek justice for his mother. He knew that this wasn't just about her death. It was about making sure no one else had to suffer the same fate. "I have to go home," Michael said, his voice firm. "I need to know exactly what happened." Over the next few hours, Michael booked a flight back to his hometown. He reached out to lawyers, investigators, and even local activists, preparing himself for the battle ahead. His grief was overwhelming, but it fueled his resolve. As Michael boarded the plane, the community in his hometown continued to rally together. Angela's story had touched the hearts of so many, and the demand for justice was growing louder by the hour. People lit candles at a makeshift memorial near the grocery store, leaving flowers and messages that read, "Rest in power, Angela." Michael knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for his mother, for her memory, and for the child she never got to hold, he would do whatever it took to make sure her voice was heard, even in her absence. This was no longer just his fight. It was a fight for justice and change. Michael Carter stepped off the plane with a heavy heart and a clear mission. The city he had left behind so many years ago now felt foreign to him. Memories of his childhood with his mother, Angela, flooded back. The laughter, the struggles, and the promises he made to himself to give her a better life someday. But that someday never came, and now all he had left was grief. As Michael arrived at the neighborhood, he was struck by the somber atmosphere. Outside the grocery store where the tragedy occurred, a growing crowd gathered to pay their respects. A makeshift memorial had been set up, with candles, flowers, and handwritten notes. Michael approached it slowly, his heart aching as he read the messages. "You deserve better. Rest in peace, Angela." An elderly woman standing nearby recognized him. "You're her son, aren't you?" she asked softly. Michael nodded, struggling to find his voice. "Yes, I'm Michael." "She was so proud of you," the woman said, her eyes filled with sympathy. "She always talked about you, how you were going to change the world. She loved you so much." Michael felt a lump in his throat. He had no words, only regret for the time they had lost. Determined to honor his mother, Michael began speaking with witnesses who had been at the grocery store that day. Lisa, the young woman who had seen everything, agreed to meet him at a nearby cafe. She was nervous but eager to share what she had seen. "It all happened so fast," Lisa explained. "She wasn't trying to hurt anyone. She just wanted some food." When the officer arrived, he didn't give her a chance to explain. He assumed the worst. Michael listened intently, his hands clenched into fists under the table. Did anyone try to stop him? Lisa shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. We were scared. It was like he didn't even see her as a person. The more Michael learned, the angrier he became. He reached out to a private investigator, determined to uncover every detail about the incident. Within days, the investigator uncovered troubling information about Officer Mark Reynolds. It turned out that Reynolds had a history of complaints about excessive force, particularly in low-income neighborhoods. Despite these complaints, he had never faced serious consequences. Armed with this information, Michael contacted a high-profile lawyer, Rebecca Simmons, who had a reputation for taking on cases of police misconduct. Rebecca agreed to take on Angela's case, seeing it as an opportunity to seek justice not just for Angela, but for others who had faced similar tragedies. This isn't just about what happened to your mother, Rebecca told Michael. It's about holding people accountable and making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Meanwhile, the community continued to rally around Angela's memory. Protests grew larger, with chants of "Justice for Angela" echoing through the streets. Local news stations covered the events, and Angela's story gained national attention. Activists began calling for a full investigation into Officer Reynolds and the police department. Michael used his platform as a successful entrepreneur to amplify the movement. He gave interviews, sharing stories about his mother's kindness and resilience. "My mother didn't deserve to be treated like this," he said during one televised appearance. "She was a human being, a mother, and someone who deserved respect. We can't let this keep happening." As the pressure on the police department grew, they announced that Officer Reynolds would face an internal investigation. But Michael wasn't satisfied with that. He wanted transparency, accountability, and real change. The battle for justice was far from over, but Michael was determined to see it through. For his mother, for the child she never got to hold, and for the countless others who had been silenced, he vowed to uncover the truth and demand accountability. The fight had just begun, and Michael was ready to lead it. Michael Carter was relentless. After speaking to witnesses and uncovering Officer Reynolds' troubling history, he knew his mother's case was not an isolated incident. He felt the weight of responsibility not just for his mother's memory, but for the countless others who had suffered similar injustices. With lawyer Rebecca Simmons by his side, Michael began to build a powerful case. The first step was filing a wrongful death lawsuit against Officer Reynolds and the police department. The lawsuit alleged excessive force, negligence, and failure to properly train officers. It also called for an independent investigation into Angela's death. The news of the lawsuit hit the media like a storm, further amplifying the national attention the case was receiving. Meanwhile, Rebecca and her team worked tirelessly, gathering evidence and preparing for what would undoubtedly be a long legal battle. They interviewed more witnesses, collected police records, and consulted with experts on use of force protocols. What they found was damning. Officer Reynolds had been involved in multiple complaints over his career, yet each one had been brushed aside without serious consequences. As the case gained traction, protests in the community grew larger. People of all ages and backgrounds joined together, demanding justice for Angela and systemic changes in the police department. Signs with slogans like "Angela's life mattered" and "Accountability now" were carried high as protesters marched through the streets. The momentum was undeniable. Michael, though grieving, found strength in the unity around him. He spoke at rallies, sharing personal stories about his mother. "She was the strongest woman I knew," he said, his voice steady but emotional. "She worked hard every day to make sure I had a chance at a better life. She didn't deserve this, and I won't stop fighting until we see justice." Rebecca arranged a meeting with the city's police chief, demanding transparency and accountability. At first, the chief was defensive, insisting that Officer Reynolds had acted according to protocol. But under mounting pressure from the public and media, he eventually agreed to release body camera footage of the incident. The footage, when made public, confirmed what many already suspected. Angela posed no threat. She had been cooperative and simply trying to explain herself. The footage showed her reaching into her bag to pull out the loaf of bread, not a weapon. The public outcry intensified, with even more people joining the protests. Local news stations covered the story extensively, with many commentators questioning the systemic issues within the police department. National leaders and celebrities began speaking out, calling for justice and reforms. The case became a symbol of the broader fight against injustice. Back at home, Michael took moments to reflect on his mother's life. He visited their old apartment, where he found a box of her belongings. Inside were letters she had written to him but never sent, expressing her pride in his accomplishments and her hopes for his future. Reading her words brought Michael to tears, but it also gave him renewed purpose. The police department announced that Officer Reynolds would face disciplinary action and be placed on trial for his actions. This was a small victory, but Michael knew it wasn't enough. He continued to push for broader reforms, including mandatory de-escalation training, better oversight of officers with repeated complaints, and stronger accountability measures. As the trial date approached, the community rallied around Michael. Volunteers helped organize events, spread awareness, and raise funds for the legal battle. Angela's mural, painted by local artists, became a gathering spot for people to share their stories and show support. Through it all, Michael remained focused. His mother's death was a tragedy, but he was determined to turn that tragedy into a catalyst for change. He knew the fight for justice was far from over, but he also knew he wasn't alone. Together with his community, Michael was prepared to face whatever challenges lay ahead, fueled by the memory of his mother and the hope for a better future. The day of the trial had finally arrived, and the courthouse was surrounded by a sea of protesters holding signs and chanting for justice. Angela Carter's name had become a rallying cry, not just in the community but across the nation. Michael Carter walked into the courtroom, dressed in a sharp suit, his mother's memory heavy in his heart. By his side was Rebecca Simmons, his determined and sharp lawyer. Inside the courtroom, tension filled the air. The prosecution was ready to prove that Officer Mark Reynolds had acted recklessly and that Angela's death was entirely preventable. Meanwhile, the defense argued that Reynolds was simply doing his job and had acted out of fear for his own safety. It was clear that this case would be a battle of facts versus assumptions. The trial began with opening statements. Rebecca's voice was firm and unwavering as she addressed the jury. This is not just a case about Angela Carter. This is a case about responsibility, accountability, and the need for change. Angela was an unarmed, pregnant woman trying to feed herself and her unborn child. She was treated not with compassion, but with suspicion, and it cost her life. The defense's opening statement painted a different picture, emphasizing the high-pressure environment police officers face and claiming that Reynolds had acted in accordance with his training. Michael clenched his fists as he listened, anger simmering just beneath the surface. The prosecution called their first witness, Lisa, the young woman who had witnessed the shooting. Lisa recounted the events of that day, her voice steady but emotional. Angela wasn't a threat. She was scared and trying to explain herself. Officer Reynolds didn't give her a chance. Next, Rebecca presented the body camera footage, which had already been seen by the public but now played a crucial role in the trial. The courtroom was silent as the video showed Angela's final moments. The jury watched as she reached into her bag to pull out the loaf of bread, only to be met with gunfire. Gasps filled the room, and some jurors visibly winced. When Officer Reynolds took the stand, his demeanor was tense. He admitted that he had made a split-second decision, but insisted that he had acted out of fear. Rebecca's cross-examination was sharp and focused. Officer Reynolds, were you aware that Angela Carter was unarmed? I didn't know what she had in her bag, he replied. And yet you chose to shoot first, Rebecca pressed. Is that what you were trained to do? Reynolds hesitated, his confidence faltering. I thought I saw a weapon. Rebecca's voice softened, but her words were piercing. Do you think you would have made the same assumption if Angela Carter wasn't a young black woman struggling to explain herself? The courtroom fell silent. The question hung in the air, forcing everyone to confront the underlying biases that had played a role in Angela's death. Michael took the stand next, sharing his perspective as Angela's son. He spoke about her struggles, her strength, and her dreams for a better future. "My mother didn't deserve this," he said, his voice breaking. "She was a human being, just like everyone else. She deserved to be treated with dignity, not suspicion." The defense tried to paint Angela as a lawbreaker, emphasizing her attempt to steal the loaf of bread. But Rebecca countered with compassion. "Stealing a loaf of bread is not a crime worthy of death," she argued. Angela Carter was trying to survive, not harm anyone. As the trial continued, experts testified about police training, de-escalation techniques, and the importance of implicit bias training. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury appeared deeply moved by the testimonies. Outside the courthouse, the protests grew louder, but they were no longer just about Angela. They were about a system that had failed her and so many others. Michael, though exhausted, felt a sense of purpose as he addressed the crowd one evening. "This isn't just about my mother," he said. "This is about changing the system so no one else has to lose their loved one like this." As the trial neared its conclusion, Michael and Rebecca prepared for the final phase, the closing arguments. They knew that the fight for justice was far from over, but they were ready to see it through. The courtroom had become a battleground, but for Angela's memory, they wouldn't back down. Justice had to prevail. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back into their seats. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the verdict that would decide not only the fate of Officer Mark Reynolds, but also whether Angela Carter's life would receive the justice it deserved. Michael Carter sat at the edge of his seat, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Rebecca Simmons, his lawyer, gave him a reassuring nod. The judge asked the jury foreperson to stand. The foreperson, an older woman with kind eyes, unfolded a piece of paper and began to read. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Officer Mark Reynolds, guilty of reckless endangerment and manslaughter." A collective gasp filled the courtroom, followed by murmurs of relief and a few quiet cheers from Angela's supporters. Michael closed his eyes, a wave of emotions washing over him. Grief, relief, and a bittersweet sense of victory. Justice had been served, but it could never bring his mother back. The judge called for order, banging the gavel to quiet the room. "Officer Reynolds," he said sternly, "your actions on that day were a grave misuse of your authority. This court sentences you to 8 years in prison and mandates you to participate in bias and de-escalation training programs." Reynolds' head hung low as he was led away by officers. Michael watched him go, feeling no joy in the man's punishment, only a hope that this would prevent future tragedies. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of protesters had gathered, waiting for the outcome. When the news broke, cheers erupted. The community, which had come together to demand accountability, finally felt that their voices had been heard. Signs waved in the air, reading "Justice for Angela" and "Change starts here." Michael stepped outside, greeted by the flashes of cameras and the cheers of supporters. Rebecca stood by his side, and the two addressed the crowd. "Today, we achieved justice for my mother, Angela Carter," Michael began, his voice strong. "But this is only the beginning. This verdict is not just about one case. It's a call to action for systemic change." Rebecca followed with a powerful statement. "This trial showed us that accountability is possible, but we must continue to push for reforms that ensure no one else has to suffer like Angela did. This is about creating a future where compassion and understanding come first." The crowd applauded, but Michael's mind was already on the next steps. He knew the fight didn't end with a verdict. True change required ongoing effort, and he was ready to dedicate himself to that mission. In the days that followed, the city announced a series of reforms. The police department committed to implementing mandatory de-escalation training for all officers, creating an independent review board to handle complaints, and establishing community outreach programs to rebuild trust. Michael, using his influence and resources, launched the Angela Carter Foundation, a nonprofit organization aimed at supporting families affected by police violence and advocating for justice reform. The foundation quickly gained traction, drawing donations and partnerships from across the country. Meanwhile, Angela's story continued to inspire people far beyond the community. Artists painted murals in her honor, poets wrote about her resilience, and activists carried her name as a symbol of the fight for equality. Angela's legacy was no longer just her tragic death. It was the hope and determination she had sparked in others. Michael often visited the mural dedicated to his mother. It depicted her standing strong, holding a loaf of bread, with the words "Her strength lives on" painted above her. He would stand there quietly, reflecting on how far they had come and how much work still needed to be done. Though the pain of losing his mother would never fully fade, Michael found purpose in the fight for justice. Angela's memory had become a beacon for change, and Michael was determined to honor her by continuing to push for a world where everyone was treated with dignity and respect. For her, for the child she never got to hold, and for the countless others like her, he vowed to keep going. Months had passed since the trial, but Angela Carter's story remained fresh in the hearts and minds of people across the nation. Her name had become a symbol of resilience and the need for justice. The city, once divided by tension, began to heal, slowly but surely, as reforms were implemented and trust began to rebuild between the community and law enforcement. Michael Carter stood at the entrance of the newly opened Angela Carter Community Center, a facility built in his mother's honor. The center was created to provide resources for struggling families, including food assistance, job training, and counseling services. Michael had used the settlement from the lawsuit and his own wealth to fund the project, determined to turn his grief into something meaningful. At the ribbon-cutting ceremony, hundreds of people gathered to celebrate. Michael took the stage, his heart pounding but his voice steady. "This center is more than just a building," he began. "It's a promise that we will continue to fight for fairness, dignity, and hope. My mother believed in helping others, even when she had so little. This is her legacy." The crowd erupted in applause, and Michael couldn't help but feel a bittersweet pride. As he cut the ribbon, children rushed inside to explore the bright, welcoming space. Laughter filled the air, a sound that reminded him of better times with his mother. Meanwhile, the police department had undergone significant changes. Officer training now included courses on empathy, de-escalation, and cultural awareness. An independent oversight committee was established to investigate complaints against officers, ensuring transparency and accountability. These changes were hard-won, and though progress was slow, it was a step in the right direction. Rebecca Simmons, who had stood by Michael through every step of the journey, joined him at the community center. "You've done something incredible here, Michael," she said, smiling. "Angela would be so proud." Michael nodded, his eyes scanning the room. "She always wanted to help people. I just wish she could see this." Rebecca placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "In a way, she does. Her story is what made all of this possible." The mural of Angela, which had been a rallying point during the protests, now hung prominently in the center's main hall. It depicted her holding a loaf of bread with a soft but determined expression, surrounded by vibrant colors and uplifting words like strength, hope, and justice. As the weeks went by, the center became a hub of activity. Single mothers found support, children received tutoring, and unemployed individuals learned new skills. Angela's memory was alive in every corner of the building, and Michael often found himself volunteering there, talking to visitors and sharing his mother's story. The national conversation around police reform continued to grow, with Angela's case cited as a turning point. Activists and leaders drew inspiration from the changes in Michael's city, pushing for similar reforms in their own communities. Angela's legacy was no longer just local, it was a movement. One evening, as Michael walked through the center, he spotted a young boy sitting alone, drawing on a piece of paper. Curious, Michael approached him. "What are you working on?" he asked. The boy held up his drawing. It was a picture of Angela, standing tall with her loaf of bread, surrounded by people holding hands. "She's a hero, right?" the boy asked. Michael smiled, his eyes misty. "Yes, she is. She's the biggest hero I've ever known." The boy beamed and went back to his drawing, while Michael took a deep breath. He knew there was still so much work to do, but in that moment, he felt a sense of peace. His mother's strength had sparked a wave of change, and her story would continue to inspire for generations. Angela Carter's life was tragically cut short, but her impact was immeasurable. Through the actions of her son, her community, and countless others who carried her story, her legacy had become one of hope, justice, and a better future for all. And for Michael, that was the most important fight of all.